The movie begins with a woman named Iris lying in bed, staring at the ceiling while her husband sleeps beside her. She appears motionless until she turns to look at a toy boat sitting on the table. Quietly, she gets out of bed, goes downstairs, grabs a Swiss Army knife, and leaves the house, but she forgets to take her phone. Iris drives along the California coast to a national park in Big Sur. She hikes to a secluded overlook where she grieves for her young son, Matteo, who tragically passed away during a hiking trip. She has created a small memorial for him at the base of a tree, bringing along his toy boat as a symbolic gesture. She carves their initials into the tree and then walks to the edge of the rocks, preparing to jump. As Iris stands on the edge, lost in her despair, a man named Richard unexpectedly appears. He quickly senses her intentions and tries to intervene, speaking calmly to distract her. Richard shares a personal story about losing his wife, Chloe, in a car crash. His gentle and persistent manner starts to break through Iris's defenses, and she gradually opens up. She shares her name and reveals the heartbreaking story of what led her to this moment. Iris explains that she and her husband were distracted when their son, Matteo, tragically fell from the same overlook. She reflects on how the world takes what it wants and admits that, despite her grief, she hasn't been able to cry. Feeling shattered, she says, "I'm broken." Richard, before leaving, reassures her with the words, "Broken doesn't have to mean hopeless," and leaves. Iris decides to follow Richard back down the trail, and they continue walking together toward the parking lot. When they reach his car, she notices that he's parked it too close to hers, blocking her driver's door. As she tries to maneuver around, Richard moves to trap her. Before Iris can fully realize what's happening, he tases her, leaving her incapacitated. Iris later wakes up in the back seat of Richard's car, her hands and feet bound with zip ties. She attempts to activate her smartwatch, but Richard warns her there's no service. He dismisses any pleas for mercy, claiming he's heard it all before. To mock her further, he gives her Matteo's toy boat, pretending to be kind. In that moment, Iris remembers the Swiss Army knife in her pocket. While Richard is busy driving, she starts working to free herself from the zip tie on her wrists. Iris tries to distract Richard by asking about Chloe, but he's not fooled. When she demands to know what he plans to do to her, he says he wants to braid her hair. Iris then breaks free and attempts to stab him. They struggle fiercely, and in the chaos, the car swerves off the road, crashing into a tree. The fight continues outside the car, a brutal back and forth, until both of them end up on opposite sides. Richard gets up and approaches her, but Iris backs away, holding the small knife at him. Richard mocks her, pointing out that just half an hour ago, Iris was ready to end her life. Then he reveals the cruel truth. He injected her with a relaxant, which will slowly paralyze her body in about 20 minutes. Ignoring the fear, Iris decides to make a run for it. She drops the knife and heads into the woods, hearing Richard's taunting voice echoing all around her. Desperate to stay sharp, she does a finger exercise she used to do with Matteo, trying to keep her body active despite the drug's effects. Iris climbs down some rocks and tries the finger exercise again, but her fingers are starting to lose movement. She slides down a hill and keeps going, but soon feels her legs getting stiff. Meanwhile, Richard follows her slowly, whistling a happy tune. Iris is now crawling, so she hides under some tree roots, trying to stay quiet as Richard stands above her, unaware of her hiding spot. She stays still as ants crawl over her face and hands, but it becomes too much to bear. She quickly crawls out from her hiding place and drags herself toward the riverbank. Richard starts chasing her, but she reaches the water first. She continues floating in the water until she spots a log, grabs it, and manages to pull herself to the shore. As the drug fully takes over on her body, Iris struggles to drag herself into a patch of grass before her body becomes completely immobile. The grass and trees around her start to move in a strange. She vaguely sees someone in the distance. Then, she hears the sound of a riding mower approaching. Just as she's about to become lost in the grass, the man on the mower spots her. He introduces himself as Bill and starts asking her questions. Iris, barely able to move, communicates by blinking, 1 blink for yes, and 2 blink for no. Bill carefully places Iris in a wheelbarrow and takes her inside his cabin. Just moments after settling her, there's a knock at the door. Iris blinks frantically, trying to warn Bill that it might be Richard. Bill then opens the door and finds Richard standing there, who introduces himself as Andrew. Richard claims he's been in a car accident and lies, saying Iris is his wife and she ran because of her mental illness. Bill tells Richard to stay outside, but Richard follows his way in and immediately spots the wheelbarrow, but Iris is not there. Bill, clearly uncomfortable, tells Richard he can either call 911 for help or to report an intruder. Richard, determined to act like a victim, starts crying and acting pathetic. Bill sits down in his comfy chair and asks Richard to tell him the truth about what's really going on. Richard then tells a sob story about his wife Chloe and her struggles with mental illness. Richard then asks for the phone to call as he lost during the accident, but Bill does not give him. Meanwhile, Iris is lying on the floor behind which Richard does not notice. He then says that his wife, Chloe, goes catatonic during her episodes. Bill, opening up, shares that his own wife died of a heart attack. Just then, Richard's phone rings, which make Bill start to suspect that Richard is lying. Realizing the situation is unraveling, Richard asks Bill about the wheelbarrow and where Iris is. Bill lies, saying he put her in the shed. The two men then start fighting, with Bill landing some solid blows and completely overpowering Richard. However, Richard manages to grab a knife and stabs Bill through the ankle, then fatally in the chest multiple times. As Richard stands over him, he hears Bill's phone ringing, still connected to 911 with the dispatcher announcing that units are on their way. Richard then checks the shed but does not find Iris there. Frustrated, he grabs a gas can and dumps it all over the cabin. As he lights the fire, Iris manages to grab hold of the blind's pulls and begins moving them. Richard gets into Bill's truck, but it does not start. He then notices blind's pulls moving and goes inside to check it, only to find Iris behind the couch. He carries her out and puts on Bill's truck. Richard belts Iris into the truck and turns her head to force her to look at the fire, saying, "See what you made me do?" As they drive away, he tells her that killing Bill was the first man he's ever killed. Just then, his phone rings. Surprisingly, it's his daughter, excited about her good report card. His wife then picks up and tells him to join them at the cabin. Richard, however, tells her he needs some time alone and hangs up the call. They drive back to the car wreck, and Iris watches as Richard grabs items from the trunk and changes into a fresh shirt, wiping the blood off his hands. He returns with more zip ties, baby wipes, and another syringe. Richard then finds some cable and hooks in Bill's toolbox and starts attaching the car to the truck. Just then, a highway patrol cop pulls up, mentioning that someone reported the truck and that there might be someone in trouble. The cop wants to talk to Iris, but Richard quickly invents a story, claiming she's just a drunk. The cop asks for Richard's ID, only to find it's expired. Then the cop asks how the wreck happened, and Richard spins another lie, telling him that drunken Iris took the car and crashed it into the tree. As the cop asks Richard how his head got all bloody, Iris quietly manages to roll the window down. Richard avoids the question, instead turning on the tears and telling the cop how they lost their son, repeating Iris' story about Mateo. Iris struggles to speak, managing a faint whisper, "Help me." The cop, suspicious, looks inside and spots the zip ties and syringe on the dashboard. Richard quickly grabs the cable and heavy hooks and smashes the cop's face before he can fire a shot. Even after the cop collapses, Richard hits him in the head a few more times with the hooks. Taking the cop's gun, Richard tosses him back into his car and sets it on fire. As they drive away, Iris regains her voice and says, "Things aren't going like you planned." Furious, Richard pulls over, and they have a tense heart-to-heart about the accident with Chloe. Richard reveals that after the crash, he found his clarity and believes he's God. His final words to Chloe were, "Thank you," as she was dying. Iris reminds Richard about his wife and daughter, telling him that he'll be caught and lose them. She begs him to leave her on the side of the road, but instead, he drives them to a boat launch where cinder blocks are waiting on the dock to drown her. Iris suddenly stabs him in the leg with the syringe she took from the dashboard. However, her fingers still aren't fully working, and she struggles to push the plunger. Richard quickly yanks the syringe out of his leg, squeezing the drug out before it can take effect. Richard then grabs a boning knife from the toolbox and sticks it in his belt along with the cop's gun. He drags her to the dock and puts her in the waiting skiff. He takes Iris to the middle of the lake, and she asks Richard to get Mateo's toy boat of her pocket for her. As he's reaching for it, Iris somehow manages to grab the knife from his belt and stabs him under the chin. While Richard stumbles around with the gun, Iris moves the boat so it tilts, making him fall into the water. She grabs the gun and shoots, hitting him and sending him back underwater. Iris laughs as she watches Richard try to swim to shore while bleeding. Then Iris realizes that she accidentally shot the boat, and it's leaking water. Still tied up, she takes a deep breath as the boat starts to sink. After a few moments, she sees Mateo's toy boat floating by. Finally, Iris manages to climb onto the dock, feeling like she's safe. But then she sees Richard pulling himself out of the water not far away. Cut to Richard, gasping his last breaths as he looks up to see Iris standing over him. She kneels beside him and says, "Thank you," before walking away, leaving him to choke on his own blood. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more interesting movie recaps.